In this video, I'm going to show why San Francisco cannot fail, share a book that changed my entire perspective on how the world works, show the power of this perspective when thinking about our world, and show where homelessness and crime fit into all of this. First, let's talk about working from home's effects on San Francisco after the pandemic. When I first came to Florida State as a real estate student last year, one of the things that we often talk about was the retail apocalypse, right? The death of malls. This was post-pandemic. People are changing how they shop. They're changing how they buy goods. They're changing everything about that sort of experience. And there was a common perception at this point that retail as we know it would be gone. The big malls were going to be gone. They were going to go bankrupt. Macy's would go bankrupt. Nordstrom's would go bankrupt. JCPenney, and a lot of them did. But what fundamentally ended up happening is that retail changed. It didn't die off, but it changed. It changed substantially and it changed structurally. But at the end of the day, retail still exists, and actually in real estate is one of the best performing classes of any of the classes right now. I think it's really important to put this all in perspective when thinking about real estate in specific when talking about vacancy, right? Because malls and etc. can have a downturn, retail can have a downturn, office can have a downturn. It's a cyclical market. Office is going to go through some very serious changes. Remote work is here to stay to some degree, but that doesn't mean we're not going to need office space in the future. And tying this back into San Francisco has always been a boom and bust sort of city, but rents were down 70% in the dot-com bubble. They're only down 15% today. So clearly San Francisco has gone through periods of decline. And just as soon as the last bust was here with the pandemic, there's a new boom coming to San Francisco, and that's with the new resurgence of artificial intelligence. Nvidia is worth nearly $3 trillion. There's all sorts of AI companies moving into the sector, and where are they all going? They're going to San Francisco. And if it's going to be as significant as an impact as we think it is, demand for office space will increase, and overall San Francisco's downtown will see a sort of resurgence. The first time I ever went to San Francisco, I was a kid, so I don't remember that much about it. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and me and my family went to San Francisco, and all I really remember is going to see this movie, and there was a Formula One race, and it was really cool. I went with just my dad, but that's about it. The last time I visited San Francisco was last summer. One of the things that was interesting was my parents, who obviously live in Southern California, they don't spend a lot of time in Northern California, and they kept telling me all the negative news that was there. It was well documented how much negative press was in San Francisco, the extent of what it was. It was almost painted this picture of a dystopian sort of city, the failure of what could happen if homelessness continued to rise, if crime continued to rise. And growing up, San Francisco was always taught in schools as one of the gateway cities of the United States. And there was a little bit of trepidation on my end trying to see what has the city really come to. But when I came back to San Francisco as a young adult, one of the things that really stuck out to me was just how beautiful the whole place was. How great the climate was, how you could go to the pier, you could see seals, you could go to the redwood forest, the scenery was amazing, the people were very friendly, and visiting the Golden Gate, visiting parts like Sausalito across the bay, and by the time I left, I wasn't thinking about all the negative headlines. I was thinking about what a great time that I had and what a cool city it is. It was just such a beautiful place, and I know that there was all this negative press there, and I was really expecting it to be some sort of dystopian society, but I really came back loving it. It was such a great visit, and I want to go back. When I was in 7th grade, we had a history class, and it took us through the beginning of civilization from Mesopotamia into the modern world, about the Industrial Revolution. And we learned about all the ancient empires. We learned about the Roman Empire. We learned about Chinese empires. We learned about Mesoamerican societies. We were assigned one film to watch. Our teacher knew that most of my fellow students, and sometimes myself, would try to catch up on sleep. But it started out in a really interesting way. Why was it that some societies succeeded while others didn't? Why was it that the Europeans were the ones doing all the colonizing and had all the advanced technology and everyone else didn't? If you just look at a map, and if you look at Europe and Asia, it's very latitudinal based, right? It's very on the long axis of the world. Whereas the rest of the world, like the Americas, is very north-south, Africa is very north-south. And one of the things that's really interesting that we were learning was when talking about growing crops and climate is crops grow on the same latitude for the most part. Obviously, this is a generalization. It's going to depend on some other factors. But when you look at the most successful societies and where they started out, they were the ones that were able to produce more food. When you increase your productivity of food and you have a surplus of food, other people can start doing other things. Instead of everyone being a farmer, now you could just have a small population be farmers, and other people can be just in the military. They can specialize in building things. They can specialize in money. They can specialize in religion. They can specialize in writing. You may have already know, but cuneiform, the first form of writing, is often thought to have evolved from dialoguing how much wheat there was and how much food there was to be available. Looking at where the early civilization started out, it's where the crops began. And societies that were in places where there was more food were the ones that had more success. And societies that had animals that were more easily domesticated also had more success. And then tying back geography into this, if you were on that latitude, you could grow those crops anywhere. So throughout Europe and throughout Asia, more domesticated animals and viable agricultural products were able to be spread from place to place, bringing with the increased amount of food production civilization. And so these societies that had access to food and can easily grow food and easily domesticate animals had a huge advantage. And I was so intrigued by that documentary that I actually went and got the book and read it, which for me in 7th grade was a big deal because I didn't read that much. I thought reading was boring, but this documentary was so interesting, I went and got the book. And that documentary's name was Guns, Germs, and Steel. I remember looking at this and it changed my entire perspective on how the world works, and just showcased how something as simple as geography and where people started out over time, compounding over hundreds and thousands of years, could end up in the world that we see today. Tying this back into my trip to San Francisco, after I left, it all kind of clicked. You know, I had that 30,000 foot view of how the world works in geography. And after leaving San Francisco, I was like, I understood why people live there. You know, you see a name and you see a headline, and it's really easy to think a certain thing. But when you actually spend time in the place and you actually see what it has to offer, you get a completely new perspective. And one of the things about San Francisco is that it's a large natural bay. The climate is gorgeous, the scenery is great. And as far as a city goes, people live there for a reason, because of the climate, because of the scenery, because of the things to do, because of the architecture that's now developed. And now there's universities that are there. There's Stanford University, there's UC Berkeley, which are some of the top universities in the world. At the end of the day, people still want to live there, and that just doesn't change overnight. If you look at it, San Francisco is set up for success. It's not set up for failure. So things can go wrong, but the city itself will still succeed because it's a natural draw to people. And this is where geography comes into play. If you look at why cities are cities, if you really think about it, a lot of cities, especially the ones in Europe, have been developing for thousands of years, have always been a natural accumulation of people and resources to one area. And San Francisco is no different. It's only 150 years old as opposed to, 1,000 years old, as the case of a city like Rome, for example. But at the end of the day, it's still a place where people naturally congregate and people naturally want to be. And that's just is very hard to overcome on the negative side. We've all heard this, that Rome wasn't built in a day. But in the reality too, it also wasn't destroyed in a day. It took hundreds of years to decline. But Rome's still there. Rome is still a city. In 1906, 75% of the city was destroyed. This is about 50, 60 years into the history of San Francisco. But what happened? The city rebuilt, and it rebuilt stronger than ever. Banks were founded like Bank of America, the Bank of California, Wells Fargo. National institutions were set up. A whole society was rebuilt. Everything was rebuilt. Everything was redone because people wanted to be there. And I think it's just so easy to forget why these places are these places. And it's so easy to paint with a broad brush. You see a negative thing happening, you see a negative headline, and you think, oh, people are gonna leave this place, and it's just, no one's gonna wanna live there, and it's gonna completely fall into decline. But San Francisco is San Francisco because of what it has to offer. So we learned about the power of geography in our society, why San Francisco is the way that it is today, and gave a little bit of a 30,000 foot view of how this all worked. But if you want to understand the mechanics of a $2 trillion industry that nobody talks about, watch my video on private credit. That's all I have, guys. Thanks for watching.